Welcome everyone to Awesome Truth, a wrestling book club. I'm your host, Steve Semino, and with me as always is my co-host, Walt Schwenk. Hey, Walters.
Hello, Steven. How's it going?
Robot voice, is that what you're going for? A robot?
I'm a little groggy right now. I feel like I just woke up from a fever dream.
Because you watched a 2-hour shitty Vice documentary?
Yeah, that specifically, which we'll talk about very shortly.
It was not a dream, it was real, Walt. It was The 9 Lives of Vince McMahon, and we're talking about it today on Awesome Truth. This is a documentary that just aired very recently. It aired last week as you're hearing this episode. It was really, really new. And Walt, for a second there in the months building when Vice announced that this was going to be on, it was on the Vice network, when they announced this was going to be a thing they were putting out into the world, coming so close to Vince McMahon retiring, stepping down amid allegations of various misconducts, we said maybe we should do a special episode. Maybe we should watch this on Vice and then drop everything and record a hot breaking, we got to talk about the juicy nuggets that are in this documentary. And Walt, I think that you will agree that there were barely any nuggets in this at all, let alone juicy ones.
I'm gonna take a step back before we get into the world of wrestling. This is the world, like the Vice, the network that tripled down on wrestling documentaries, and because they found this weird niche audience. Their news division has this weird cachet, like, oh, Vice, it's so cool, and they tell provocative stories. What the fuck was this? Like, whose bright idea was that? But, seriously, I expect this from, lazy storytelling and new reporting, quote-unquote reporting from, I don't know, Investigation Discovery or, Headline News or some other, half-rate, nonfiction network. I expected more. I don't know why, but, this was just, this is a glorified clip show that was clearly made by people who, I don't know what the original intent was, but this was barely a documentary about Vince McMahon.
Yeah, you're super right. I think as Vice is viewed by people in two spheres. In the news world, like you said, it does have this they have this reputation for, covering hard-hitting stuff and drugs and embedding themselves. I feel like they have that sort of guerrilla journalism to a certain extent. It is the reputation. Maybe that's not justified anymore, but that is definitely their sort of brand. And then there's the wrestling world, where they've done Dark Side, they've done Tales from the Territories now. I think they've built some cachet in the wrestling world as well, that they will, if they don't, uncover unknown things. Most of the stuff we've seen on Dark Side and all the Vice shows is stuff that you and I are somewhat aware of, but they dive into things that certainly mainstream wrestling fans and Joe Public doesn't know at all. And so I think that's why Dark Side has resonated, is it's enough meat for, you and I to be intrigued, and then for people who don't follow wrestling history, it's fascinating. And I think they burned potentially 2 bridges with this episode. Maybe not permanently, not like they're up and, they're charred remains, but I think they torched them pretty good, because this is just not at all what they sold it as. It was presented, at least as I understand it, to be a somewhat revelatory Vince McMahon documentary, and it's a clip show. It's a collection of WWE/WWF-centric Dark Side episodes, cut into a longer narrative with some shit at the end about how Vince has recently committed misconduct.
There's a few things that kind of tip me off. Because I think leading up to this, I didn't know this was a thing. You heard about some of the Netflix documentary projects or various other stuff floating out there that kind of went away or might be changing, or you don't know what the status is of a lot of them with regards to Vince McMahon, and a lot of this latter day news about his misconduct recently happened. And so when this Vice one came out, it was oh, I didn't know that was in the works, but okay, yeah, let's talk about Vince McMahon after all this stuff. But a few things tipped me off. One was Jericho didn't voice this, and I thought that was odd, because he's the voice of Darkseid.
It was just some guy, right?
It was just he might be someone. I've never heard of him before. They didn't really credit him, so I assume it's just a VO, anonymous VO. But also, you get to the end, you see the credits, and I'm looking at the credits. I'm I didn't see friend of the show Evan Husney's name. and his other producing partner, whose name is escaping me right now. But like, I didn't see any of those guys. I didn't see Brian Gewirtz, friend of the show, Brian Gewirtz. I didn't see like Dwayne Johnson's name. So Seven Buck Productions wasn't involved in this, and they're heavily involved in the Tales of the Territories. So I'm like, who did this then? And you come to, I guess, realize that it's just like a quote unquote news special made by the quote unquote news division, who have not been involved in these Tales of the Territory and Dark Side of the Ring at all.
For all I know, they gave it to some guy, advice to some editor, guy or girl, and they said, hey, your job is to cut a bunch of these old episodes into a one mega episode, you know? Like, and there was no creative direction necessarily at all. Like, surely there was to some extent, but there was really not a lot of thought put into what are we really weaving here? Like, it was how can we get from A to B to C to D to E in 2 hours and then present it as something more than that? It was, you know, we were joking before we got on, like, episode 50 of this show, available in our archives, awesometruth.libsyn.com, is we cut together some of our best interviews that we've done so far. Surprisingly, we did a lot of interviews in the first 50 episodes, which is pretty weird because we weren't even at people back then, and people came on, which was great. But we released that as a new episode, and it was fun. I thought it was great that we put it together. But this was that. This is a clip show. It's a best of. It's a best of Vince McMahon's various crimes and misdemeanors stretched into a way too long time frame.
I think even a better comp, and I'm surprised I didn't think of this before because I used to work at like news organizations. Like I used to work at ABC News, so I've worked on projects like this before, where it's like, oh, we have all of this archival footage of OJ or Robert
Durst.
Robert Durst,
Yeah.
Robert Durst, and so it's like, hey, we have all this exclusive like footage. Let's do another special like 10 years later, 20 years later. But like usually it's framed like we 2020 are revisiting this classic interview with a subject that is still relevant today or is now reemerged as a relevant topic. Like I'm sure they have one for Britney Spears or I'm sure there's a million examples. I mean, unfortunately, I don't really watch network news because I'm not like 70 years old. No offense, my friends at ABC, but we used to do that shit all the time. And it wasn't even like, we weren't even trying to fake it. And this felt like we were trying to pretend like it wasn't that. And it was like someone advice like, oh, Vince McMahon's in the headlines recently. Oh, don't we have like those shows that like interview people and talk about wrestling? Like, couldn't we just put together a special and kind of just backfill it with all these other wrestling stories that we have like hundreds of hours of interviews on? It's like, yeah, let's just do that.
Yeah, it wasn't. Like I said, maybe we just got excited for the first of these Vince projects to come to light. Like you said, maybe we conflated it with the other ones. Maybe we bought into the branding of the network it was going to be on and the recent output they've had related to wrestling. I don't know, but I don't recall this being sold as in any way a amalgamation of Vince-related stories. Like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we just got excited, and we shouldn't have because it was somewhat clear that this was going to be a rerun. But I thought there was going to be substance here. And I guess the one thing I did definitely know beforehand was Meltzer and Brian Alvarez were both talking on social media about how they participated in the 9 Lives of Vince McMahon documentary. So that definitely made me think, okay, like this is going to be something of substance, you know? Maybe not groundbreaking, but there's going to be some value here in watching it. And, you know, the 2-hour thing is sort of a giveaway at this point, too, because there's not 2 hours of new information that I'm aware of, and that's a very long time for a document. Like, it does seem like it was inevitably going to be padded with that amount of time, you know? Like, there's no way they had enough there to stretch it out to that point.
But we really stretched it out. Like the cold open was all about like the recent headlines. I know you have to kind of start at the beginning with every story, and I get that, but it's just like, oh fuck, we're starting all the way in North Carolina.
Vince McMahon was born in a trailer park. I was like, no, don't do this.
Sake. Yeah. I mean, the one thing I'll say is like the Vince McMahon story truly is like the series finale of Tales from the Territory. Not to say that it's going away, but like if there was a like. If that was a miniseries, the Vince McMahon story is certainly the like it's the finale. That's like the final chapter of the territories. Is Vince McMahon coming in and doing all this shit. So like, part of me is like, had that thought, but like shoehorning every other story into his, it's like now we're kind of going a little loosey goosey because it's like any wrestling story could be relevant to Vince McMahon because he is relevant to wrestling, and that's where you start to really see it stretch in later acts of this 2 hour story where it's like, oh yeah, I mean, I guess you could call that one of the 9 lives of Vince McMahon, but that was just a story that happened in wrestling, and it just so happened that Vince was connected to it. But like, all right, sure.
Yeah, like to go through some of the things they talk about here. They talk about the John Stossel Dr. D story, where Dr. D, David Schultz, punched John Stossel because he said wrestling was fake. That's a Dark Side episode. And also, that's not really about Vince McMahon. Like you said, that's the most tangentially Vince-related story of them all, because Vince told Dr. D to do something, but like that's not that big of a deal. Like it's certainly messed up, and like I believe David Schultz got fired after that, and everyone sort of freaked out about it, but it's not. Of all the things Vince has done and his wrestlers have done, that's such a low-level crime, you know? Assault is technically not a joking matter, but it's not like a condemnable. We're not hanging Vince on the cross for that one. And then there's a Snuka story, which is a wild story, and Vince probably participated in covering up a murder, but it's also like it's not really a Vince story. Like it's its own story. Like that's a Dark Side story that is real. Vince comes in at certain points, but it's not a Vincey tale. Like, you know? And I get that the 9 lives thing feels like a real conceit when you get to that point, because you're like, oh, you're trying to make it seem like there's all these, you know, the walls were closing in, and then Vince escapes. The walls, and I'm like kind of, I guess, like steroids certainly, but then the screw job comes up, and you're like, the screw job is not about. To their credit, they don't linger on the screw job very long. But you're like, that has so little to do with Vince's crime. That's a wrestling crime, you know. It's not. Yeah. It's not a real crime.
Yeah, I mean, that was a reflection of how poorly they were doing from a business perspective.
And they let Pritchard, of course, repeat it. It's like, well, Brett cost too much money. It's like, come on. Like, I know I'm glad they moved on, but like, of course they give the screwjob 3 minutes of air, and Pritchard gets 2 of those, telling his version.
I mean, thank God we didn't linger longer than we did on the screwjob. Like,
I knew you were gonna get mad. I was like, Walt's gonna hate this.
Oh, I was furious.
Screwjob. The 800th time we've heard about the screwjob and doing something for this podcast.
Right, and the death of WCW. It's like, wow, this is part of my fever dream. Is like, oh, I had this horrible nightmare that I'm reliving yet again, all of the greatest hits of overtold wrestling stories. And it's like, nope, you're sitting through it again. And this was supposed to be like groundbreaking and interesting. Like, and oh, we got you. It's the screw job again.
And we get Vince Russo, you know, it's doing his a chunkier modern version of Vince Russo doing his version of these stories. The Owen Hart stories involved, like, it just really feels like glued together pieces from so many stories. Like, even if you didn't know Dark Side like we did, even if you weren't critiquing this for a podcast, I still think you'd watch this and go, I can see the seams, you know? I can see how this all doesn't really fit. It feels compiled. Like, I just think there's no other way to watch this and think about it.
The one thing that they tried to like loosely connect was like, you know, Vince wanted to take the company public, and that was his undoing. I'm like, he took the company public like 22 years ago. Like, the things that are happening now, like, yeah, sure, like stakeholders and stock, like, you know, stockholders and appeasing like the board and the public, like stockholders. Like, yeah, I understand that, like, that's what ousted him when these things came out. But like in 2000, it's not like, oh, he wrote his own like grave or he dug his own grave by taking the company public. It's like, this guy made billions of dollars. Like, I don't think this was a misstep. Like, in fact, that was probably a pretty smart move, I would say.
Yeah, he ran a wrestling monopoly for 2 decades after that and made untold amounts of money. I don't think, I get that he technically hoisted himself on his own petard because then, like you said, they had to appease other people, so Vince couldn't be the sole boss anymore to a certain extent. But yeah, I don't think Vince regrets that choice in the least.
That's where we've really kind of just cut to the chase, where it's like, oh, and then creative got lazy because why would you care about creative when you're making billions? It's like, okay, I'm not going to argue that, but that also isn't like, is that a reason why that was that a downfall for Vince? Like, or is that like the smartest thing the business wrestling promoter ever did?
And don't they also make it clear that creative being bad doesn't really even matter at a certain point, especially this point because of TV rights? Like they're
Pretty
locked
much.
in. Creative is irrelevant to a certain extent.
Yeah. Vince Russo's like, oh, I can't watch this shit, bro. It's like, all right, so he did a good, so great. So he's making money off all these marks despite the shitty product. Like, I
Yeah,
don't know.
sounds like objectively very good business, like maybe not subjectively a good product, but if it's working, it's hard to critique that part of it.
Right. So
The one thing I will say that was, I do, and if there's an hour version of this that I think is much more palatable, and I think it focuses on stuff like the woman Vince raped. I believe her name is Rita Chatterton. Is that right?
yeah,
Let me
I think so.
confirm that. Yes, Rita Chatterton, who Vince was accused of raping, allegedly raped her. But that story, the thing I did not realize that, or maybe I knew this, but it didn't really process, is she went on television and talked about this and it wasn't just like a story in the paper one day that went away. Like she went on an active campaign to tell the world what Vince did, and it was brushed aside, forgotten, left sort of in the dust, and like obviously it happened many decades ago in a time when these stories weren't reported on necessarily. If a woman was reporting on a man doing this, it often was brushed aside, especially if that man was powerful. But it still was. That's the thing where I look at that and you're like, okay, this is the shit that Vince is now accused of doing yet again over this many times in between. And that's a guy thing where you're like, okay, this is Vince doing an awful deed that did eventually come back to bite him in the ass. This is a window into Vince McMahon's personality, into the choices he makes, into how he wields his power, into how he overplays his hand and does awful deeds. Like that's the kind of thing I sort of wish maybe there isn't enough substance there for a full hour, but I wish they had just taken the time to focus on the actual crimes Vince committed, the accused of committing, is perpetuating in the world, and like actually try and dive into who this man really was and is.
yeah. Well, I also see a scenario too. Not that I'm trying to like fantasy book my Vince stock here, but like,
We might as well because this one was so stupid.
sure, yeah. Maybe Vice is listening. Feel free to steal these ideas, I guess. But like, I also like the Rita Chatterton thing is like interesting in a sense that, well, it's horrible. But taking that story and seeding it with the plane ride from hell and like other instances of Vince and hush money, because to say like the Rita Chatterton thing is the same as what's happening now. That's like, or not now. What's now being like uncovered in the last 20 years with Vince. Like, there's all these different reports, but the thing that really got him in trouble was like hush money with a consensual relationship. But like the idea of this guy, like, instead of the 9 lives of Vince, or like, trying to connect it, like what's happening now in this catching up to him, the same as like Chris Benoit, like, they're two different things to me. What I think though, they like you were kind of getting at, but also these other stories to hit on is the fact that like this guy has paid a lot of money over the years to a lot of different things to help cover up or like push under the rug so many things. And you could either even theme it like the misogyny or just in general, like hush money, like the Vince McMahon's hush money, like is really the thesis of this, because that's what got him in trouble is the money, not the action, if that makes sense. Like, and there's plenty of examples of that too. And the Montreal Screwjob has nothing to do with any of this. You know what I mean?
Yes. It's yeah. Even if you want to extend that to, like you said, the plane ride and the cultivation of an environment that's lawless terrain, and you can tie that back to wrestling as an entity to a certain extent too. Like you can say the wrestling's been a boys' club. Probably the nicest way to put it is a boys' club for as long as it's been around. It's been male centric. You've been allowed to get away with murder, sometimes literally, as we said. But at the very most, you're allowed to be dismissive, if not cruel, and sexually manipulative to the women who are involved. And there's the story right there. There's how you tie it to wrestling history. There's how you tie it to Vince's previous possible misdemeanors, his current possible crimes. Like there's a through line there that I think is, to me, is very clear. But what you got to do if you do that, if you're really going to go, like, you can probably cobble together a dark sidey version of that. But what I really wish this doc had done is not try to do what feels to me like hit a deadline. Like I feel like they tried to get this out because I think Tales of the Territory just ended, and so they're like, here's the Vince doc, and that's the end of the wrestling on Vice for a little while. So it feels to me like they were trying to hit a deadline like Star Wars Rise of Skywalker. Like, here's this shitty Star Wars movie that we rushed because we got to get it out for Christmas 2019, and it doesn't matter that it's bad. We know it's probably bad, but here's your stupid Star Wars movie. It'll make money anyway. Like, this feels like we had to put a doc out where instead, like you said, go into Vince's past. If you're really doing a Vice journalism type documentary, find women who are willing to corroborate these stories. Find previous employees. Bring in anybody who might add more weight to this. You know, like, I'm convinced those people exist, and I'm convinced that if Vice had put their full back into it, it's possible they might have gotten something of substance there. But they didn't, and so instead, this is all, you know, like you said, it is interspersed with wrestling talk and talk of the Attitude Era and talk of Chris Benoit, like things that are not really Vince-centric and certainly aren't tied to what's going on with Vince now.
Yeah, if this was a real news special, yeah, that's what you do, is you find people who can kind of support these new claims,
even just like off to the side, like even just someone saying, like, I know the end, there's the one soundbite of Russo being like, it's the tip of the iceberg, and I'm like, okay, Vince Russo, what does that mean? Like, the tip of a white iceberg, where, when, how? Like, give me something of value there. Give me some definitive statements, not vague assurances that where there's smoke there's fire.
Yeah, especially Russo saying that with no follow-up at the tail end of 2 hours on Vince McMahon. I don't even care at that point. You know what I mean?
If you know something, you're not telling us, you're being an asshole. And if you don't know anything, then why are you even saying that?
But also, too, like, why isn't that the story? Like, if there's, like, yeah, Vice is so, like, journalistic and hard, you know, cutting edge, and insert fucking adjectives to describe, like, whatever the hell people believe of Vice
down
news.
And dirty.
Yeah, like, why aren't we uncovering that story? Why are we retreading what I've learned in the pro wrestling history, or the comic book history of pro wrestling? Like, and honestly, the comic book, I don't mean to say this lately because I love that book, but, like, they did a much better job than fucking Vice telling the story of Vince McMahon and the history of pro wrestling and WWE. Yeah, I'd rather fucking sit there and read the comic book than this quote unquote news special. And isn't that a problem?
Yeah.
Is there a problem with that sentence?
Especially because this starts at the first second of this documentary and at the halfway point. It starts with a Vince McMahon declined to participate in this documentary. It's like, yeah, of course he did. Why would he not? Like, A, why would he do that for legal reasons? And B, this is barely a documentary. So, like, why would he participate in this? Like, it does counteract my previous point, but why would anyone participate in this? Like, I get why Meltzer and Alvarez would pop in and do an hour or two. Like, that's fine. They're wrestling journalists. That wrestling historian guy, Russo, has never met a bit of publicity he wouldn't, you know, beg to be involved in. So I get why they're all there. But, like, why would Vince participate in this? And why? Like, it's just, there's nothing there. So why, like, and the fact that they sell that as a point in their favor is embarrassing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
it makes it sound like it's going to have that Vice edge to it, you know?
Sure.
It's so like shocking. Vince didn't even want to get involved. Like, yeah, well, of course. Like, it's not. So you're lying. Vince didn't want to get involved because it's dumb, and why would he?
Right. Well, I mean, first off, Vince is trying to get his old job back. So.
Oh, we should probably talk about that too.
Yeah, but also too, like, Vice had all of the talking heads they needed. They didn't need Vince because he wasn't interviewed in one of their previous episodes of wrestling documentaries. So why would they would take Vince declined, but also we didn't ask him because we had everybody else in the world talking about this shit. So like that's how lazy this was. Even if Vince gave them an available date for the interview, they'd been like, I think we're good. We don't need Vince. It's like, that's kind of how this felt. It's like, oh, well, that would be more work to get Vince. So let's just not do that.
It's just the presentation of it just feels very disingenuous. And it's also, I feel stupid acting like we're the sanctimonious documentary police, though. I mean, like, tut, Vice, how dare you sell us a bill of goods? But at the same time, like we said, it's just, I really expect a little bit more from them, And this doesn't make me want to watch this. I was already sort of wondering if Darkseid and everything, if they told all the stories they need to be told, and this definitely makes me feel like I have no interest in really watching a lot of Vice wrestling content anymore.
No, I mean,
no offense to Brian Gewirtz. Tales of the Territories is probably a fine program that we'll probably cover at a certain point, but my enthusiasm levels are certainly lower after watching this.
Again, though, once I saw the credits and I didn't see any of the normal names that I'm used to seeing at the end of these, I'm like, oh, yeah. Well, if I had watched the credits first and saw these lists of names I've never heard of, I probably would have reconsidered my ability or my interest in watching this. And also, I am the goddamn documentary police. I used to work in goddamn news production. So
and you host a wrestling podcast, Book Club. So
not to flex my IMDb muscles. I do have like skin in this. Like, fuck these people for thinking that can.
That's true. I can't argue with that. You have the pedigree.
Yeah. So I'm the documentary police. Remember that.
Someone has to be, especially the wrestling documentary police. If not us, then who?
Right. Well,
I'm
sure we're not the only ones in the wrestling podcast community that are bitching about this.
Oh, if you look it up, like I was trying to find some stuff because I was tweeting that we're covering this, and I was trying to find just a little bit of stuff. It looks to me, and maybe they didn't. I can't say this with certainty because it's not like I was keeping an eye on this for the last couple of weeks. It looks to me like there's a ton of negative coverage of this. There's a ton of like, this is stupid, this is a waste of time. It also seems like Vice is scrubbed to a certain extent this from a lot of their website, or at least is certainly not promoting it. At least has read the tea leaves. They licked their finger and held it up, and they saw the wind was blowing a certain way, and they said, you know what, we're just gonna not mention this ever again because it is really just people saying this stinks, this stinks, this stinks, and Vice mentioned it a few days ago on Twitter, and then has sort of left it to be, which is probably smart on their end. But to me, another illustration that maybe this was meant to just be a quick cash grab and move on with their lives.
Right, and then it's understood why the normal names weren't involved in this, because like when you do talk to Evan Husney or you do talk to Brian Gewirtz, like these are people embedded in this community that like actually care about the content and the source material and like telling these stories the right way and like creating these relationships with like Martha Hart and all that and like people similar to Martha Hart and many others in the wrestling or wrestling and wrestling adjacent. And it just seems like there's not one person who was involved in this that probably gave a shit about wrestling and probably didn't know a whole lot about Vince and probably doesn't really know what's happening now. So, yeah, again, cash grab is a great word to describe this. Lazy is my number one word. It's somewhere in between those two words, to be perfectly honest.
Let's talk real quick though before we wrap up, Walt. What do you think about the rumors that Vince is coming back? Obviously, there is a rush to, I don't want to say pile on necessarily, but to nominally expose the things he's done, to talk about, you keep hearing about how morale is so much higher now that Vince is gone. Now that I'm hearing that Vince is coming back rumors, there's a lot of people insisting that like, no, they're going to fight this to the death. Do you think there's any chance that he actually comes back?
Oh, I mean, I don't know what power he has to, because I mean, the only way he gets it back is by taking it, right?
Yes.
Like, no one's just gonna give him the company.
No, from what I understand, he owns over 50% of stock, and he also has a lot of the voting power. So But but he also, I believe, the board of directors has the authority over whether he literally comes back as chairman or not. I don't think he can just take that. I think he can. I think he has to I think he can fight for it, but he has to be voted back in to a certain extent, something like that.
It's funny. I heard similar reports. I've read similar reports, and it's like, oh, Vince McMahon was given bad advice to step down as like head of the company. It's like, bro, you were given a lot of bad advice over the years because of all the shit that we know of you and the creative process and just things in general. Seems like this is just another example of you getting some bad advice from either yes men or people who don't know any better. But it's just wrestling, I guess.
He's so old. Like, he's 77 years old. Like, he's done so much. He looks more and more like a skeleton every time he's on TV. I know it is not in people, the nature of people like him to sit still and rest and look back on a lifetime of accomplishment and bullets dodged and trouble escaped from, but I just don't, at this point, I'm just like, dude, please don't do this. Like, no one wants this. We've all accepted the world without you. We cannot deny your contributions. You are probably the most important man in the history of professional wrestling. Just stay home and just like sit for a sec. Like it's just so sad that this is already coming back into the news as a potential idea. Like that guy's mind is just I don't even know.
I mean, I think I'm on your side here when like I'm not rooting for this. I'm not rooting for this like media campaign where he's like trying to come back, because it is kind of sad. And it's like, we accept that you've done a lot of weird, very bad things. We can uncouple a little bit as fans growing up in this, where we say you did a lot of influential things in this industry and will be regarded as X, Y, and Z things. And it is sad to see like him leave like this and then try and come back like, oh, just kidding, wait, I didn't have to leave, don't you love me still? It's just like, we don't want this. But I'm very interested to see how this plays out, because it's just going to be like weird and messy and probably more interesting than the actual product. I mean, as much as I like some of the direction that the new regime is doing, like, this story is more interesting objectively than anything that's happening on screen, other than maybe the bloodline.
Yeah.
So,
like, does Stephanie have to pick a side now? Like, Hunter or Vince? Like, is that sounds like a wrestling thing? But like, does she? Because she seems like she'd wield a lot of power behind the scenes. Like, does she have to choose a mate here?
We just saw this with Disney. Right? I mean, it's different. I'm not saying it's apples to apples here, but like with Iger coming back and replacing his replacement, it's not inconceivable that Vince ends up back. And I think that's the weird part about this, is like, this could just be just like a stunt, and this could just be just getting his name back in the press. But like, I don't know how this shit works. So
yeah,
this could just be a thing that happens too.
I mean, a point not in his favor is what we were sort of talking about before, and what the documentary says. You can sort of put WWE on autopilot to a certain extent, like they don't. It didn't matter when Vince was in charge that ratings were constantly falling, because they kept making money through other revenue streams, and so it wasn't so much about the millions of people watching. It was like, it's the only game in town. It's the number one game in town, regardless of what the numbers are. It's still winning as a wrestling show. It's still winning based on other shows on television. So like, since H has been in charge, as far as I know, it's been pretty much the same. So like, what reason would there be to go back to Vince? It's not like H pretty much just kept it on course. As far I haven't seen a ton of changes, despite us all thinking like, oh man, it's gonna be so different. They're gonna bring Gargano back, and they're gonna do this and that. As far as I can tell, it's been the same. It was 6 months ago. So
yeah, same.
So like, why bring Vince back? Like, what's the difference? If you're in the business of making money, they're still making money, as far as I can tell.
The stock price went down when Vince, quote unquote, retired. I mean, I don't even know what to call it anymore. But like, when he retired, the stock went down, and it stayed down or kept going down. And then the creative was fine. people seem to be happier, morale seems to be higher, but like the company's losing money potentially, or if the TV deals come back around and like they don't make as much, I could see there being change there, whether that's reflected because of creative or just the way the industries are going, the media industry, or Comcast Universal just doesn't have the money to pay wrestling $1 billion. I don't know, but another scenario too I kind of can see unfold is what if like Nick Khan takes over and then there's changes below him and he says who the hell else can run the wrestling part of this business. It's like, oh, I know this Vince guy knows something.
He was good at it 30 years ago and has been increasingly bad at it since then.
Yeah, so I mean, like, that's not inconceivable. I mean, like, a lot of things would have to happen, but
yeah, it's definitely telling that he did not just, in wrestling parlance, take his ball and go home. Like he. And I think we all probably could have guessed this. I don't know if we mentioned this on our episode, but it didn't. It seemed like he was either going to keep being buried under a weight of charges and allegations and breaking news, or he was going to wait it out and then see how the world was sort of going. And it seems like the latter's happening. Like he seems like he wasn't pilloried, he wasn't destroyed over this, at least like in the court of public opinion, and more than he already had been over the course of his life. And I guess now he feels like, well, I can take a crack at trying to come back. I still don't think it's going to happen, but if he puts his mind to it and he goes scorched earth, it'll definitely be a wild ride.
Yeah, because I mean, just as Vince Russo alluded to, like there's probably more stories to burn Vince with, but I don't know. Maybe there's enough stories to burn everybody. Maybe it's like
mutually assured destruction.
Maybe. I mean, maybe I'm trying to think of a good. I keep thinking of Game of Thrones, and I'm like, it's lazy, but like this feels like it's just all gonna end tragically.
Yeah, it could mean the house cleaning. Who knows? Maybe H doesn't get it. Does feel kind of weird that H just gets to take over so cleanly, and so neatly. It's like, well, H is in charge now, and now a new H era. That does seem a little too tidy.
Maybe. I mean, like, I don't know many H stories, the scandalous H stories.
He barely even drank, right? It didn't seem like he was a troublemaker.
No, I mean, everything you saw that he did that was out of bounds was on screen, and you could always argue that wasn't even his call.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but I could be wrong. Maybe I'm like so grossly wrong about this. Maybe he's a terror somewhere.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll find out. As you said, what is going to happen in the weeks and months to come will probably be better than the 9 lives of Vince McMahon. Yes. This is not a good documentary. Walt, I think we can officially say this is not a treat. And if you have not consumed this yet, if you didn't get swept up in the slight fervor that led to it, I would say stay very far away from it.
But I feel like we bear the headline by declaring treat or not treat so late into the show. These shows, we should really lead with this is not a treat.
But then they're not going to listen if we tell them it's not a treat early. They got to get to the end. Like, even though we're clearly shitting on it for 40 minutes, there's people out there going, "Are they going to? Is it a treat or is it not a treat? Tell us."
Jeez,
we got to make it work.
I really imagine and hope that that's how people listen to this podcast is by waiting for the treat meter.
Our 100 of listeners waiting for it to be a treat.
Yeah, right. In which case, then great. It's not a treat, and that's our rating.
And I hope Vice makes up for it at some point down the line. And that would be. They don't have to pay penance directly to you and I, but I mean, I hope that the content that, as you said, friend of the show Evan Husney and all the other people make for that channel has a little more shine to it when future episodes come out.
Yeah, well, I mean, if we do talk to a friend of the show, Brian Goritz, about Tales of the Territory, I think a fair question would be were you guys ever asked to ever do this one?
Yeah. By the way, he's not a friend of the show yet. He's a friend. I would love for him to be a close personal friend, but I think we can't give him that moniker just yet.
Well, he did He did tweet at us.
He did
about the show. So
he's not. But so did Dave Bautista. Is Dave Bautista friend of the show?
Sure.
All right. If we can say acknowledgement on Twitter counts as friend of the show, then I'll take Dave and Gewurtz both fall in that category. So.
Yeah. So Dave, if you want to come on the podcast,
yeah, I would love. Dave, and Walt will atone for his crimes of saying that your book was bad.
I don't remember. That was too long ago.
It was literally 4 years ago. So I think it's water under the bridge now.
That's going to be my undoing. Is someone's going to bring that up professionally many years later, and I'm going to have to retire in disgrace.
Well, if Dave does die in Guardians 3, he might have some time on his hands. So
great.
We'll see. So
maybe he'll write another book.
Yeah, I would love to read a Batista 2. That'd be great.
Yeah.
It'd be like Heat 2, but Dave 2.
Yeah, perfect.
Oh, we'll see.
Treat.
Well, if you want more to hear us talk about Brian Gewurtz, Dave Bautista, Vince McMahon, all the various characters that came up on this episode, you can find our archives at awesometruth.libsyn.com. You can also subscribe to us, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, everywhere podcasts are delivered, we are there. And you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at awesometruthpod. Well, I want to say I'm very, very glad that we did not drop everything several days ago and recorded an emergency episode on this documentary, because I think we would have been even angrier than we were talking about it today. Yeah, the emergency was we didn't get this up into the world quick enough out of rage. But we got it done, and that's what matters. And thank you all so much for listening. Remember, the truth will set you free.